asked my uncle's lawyer to restate the basis for their claim one more time, slowly, for the record. The lawyer cleared his throat. He said my uncle had acted as a de facto guardian during a critical period of my development, and that the estate, the one my grandmother had spent 40 years building, rightfully reflected that contribution. I was sitting at the respondent's table, alone, no lawyer next to me, no legal pad covered in someone else's handwriting. Just me, a manila folder, and a single document I had printed at the library the night before. My uncle glanced over and allowed himself a small smile. I let him have it. I was 11 years old, the last time I saw the inside of my grandmother's house before she took me in. My mother had driven me there on a Thursday afternoon in October, which I remember because I had a spelling test the next day, and I was going over the words in my head the whole ride. Necessary, privilege, conscience, the way kids do when they're trying not to think about the fact that something is wrong. My mother was quiet in a way she didn't usually get quiet. Not tired quiet. Deliberate quiet. She kept both hands on the wheel, which she never did. She pulled up to the curb and left the car running. She said she needed me to go ring the bell and ask Gran if she could watch me for the weekend. She said she had some things to take care of and she'd be back Sunday. I said, "What things?" She said, "Just go ring the bell, Nora." I got out with my backpack. I walked up the front path. I turned around once to check if she was watching, and she was. But she was watching the way you watch a door close, not the way you watch a person walk away. I rang the bell. Gran opened the door in her house slippers and looked at me, then looked past me toward the street. By the time she looked back, my mother's car was gone. Gran's name was Loretta. She was 67 years old, 5'2", and had strong opinions about the right way to fold a fitted sheet and the wrong way to load a dishwasher. She had a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended with a focus I have never seen applied to anything else in my entire life. She talked to her tomato plants. Not baby talk, more like updates. "We've had some cold nights, but you're doing fine. Don't rush yourself." She'd lived alone in that house for 9 years, since my grandfather passed. When I showed up on her porch with a backpack and no explanation, she didn't panic. She didn't call anyone. She looked at me for a moment, then she stepped aside and held the door open and said, "You eaten?" I hadn't. She made me a grilled cheese and tomato soup and didn't ask me any questions until I had finished all of it. Then she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and she said, "Your mama leave a number?" I shook my head. She nodded slowly, like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "All right," she said. "You'll sleep in the boo room." Sunday came and went. My mother didn't. Gran enrolled me in the local middle school the following week. She didn't make a fuss about it. She got my records transferred, bought me new sneakers because mine were getting small, and drove me to school on my first day without telling me everything was going to be fine, which I appreciated because neither of us actually knew that yet. It took 3 months for anyone to make it official. There were caseworkers, and forms, and a home visit, and a court date that Gran took me to in her church clothes, even though I was the one being assessed. The judge asked me a few questions. I answered them. Gran sat in the gallery and didn't look nervous, or if she was, she'd decided not to show me. Temporary guardianship, then permanent. My mother signed the paperwork from somewhere in Nevada. That was the last legal record of her in my life for the next 17 years. Gran's house had rules. Dinner at 6:30, homework before television. If you borrowed something, you returned it in better condition than you found it. Sunday mornings were for church and Sunday afternoons were for whatever you wanted, no questions asked. She never once made me feel like a burden, not in the way adults sometimes don't say the thing, but you can feel it anyway. The small sighs, the eyes that go somewhere else when you walk into a room. Gran never had that. When I walked into a room, she looked up. That sounds like such a small thing. It wasn't. She taught me to cook her mother's recipes, written on index cards in handwriting so old it looked like a different language. She let me help in the garden, which mostly meant I held things and handed her tools, and she narrated what she was doing like a nature documentary. She drove me to every school event, sat in every uncomfortable gymnasium chair, clapped louder than was strictly necessary. She went to every single one, I started to understand what it felt like to be someone's first priority, and the understanding came slowly, the way your eyes adjust to light after a long time in the dark. My uncle, my mother's older brother, appeared occasionally at holidays. He was charming in the way people are charming when they want something, all eye contact and remembered details. He knew the names of my teachers. He brought Gran expensive things she didn't need and accepted her food and her compliments and then disappeared again for months at a time. Gran loved him the way you love a person you remember clearly as a child, the version of them you knew before they became who they are now. She kept a photo of him on the mantel from when he was maybe 12, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun. She was loyal to that kid in the photograph, even when the man in front of her made it difficult. He called her every Sunday. I'll give him that. He called every Sunday and talked for exactly as long as it took to confirm she was still fine and still there. I was 26 when Gran had her first stroke. It was minor, they said. She spent 4 days in the hospital and came home with new medications and a follow-up schedule and a look in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, more like she'd been reminded of something she'd been trying not to think about. I moved back in. I'd been living 40 minutes away, working as a billing coordinator for a medical group, and I reorganized my entire life in about a week. I want to be clear that I'm not saying this to be a martyr. I'm saying it because it matters to what comes later. I moved back in and I took her to her appointments and I managed her medications and I learned which brands of crackers she liked and I sat with her in the evenings and watched the game shows she loved and I called her doctor when something seemed off and I learned what seemed off. I did this for 3 years. My uncle called every Sunday, same as before. Gran died on a Wednesday in March. She was 78. She had told me the previous Christmas that she'd had a good life and she wasn't afraid. And she said it so matter-of-factly, like she was reading off a grocery list, that I almost laughed. Then I understood she was giving me something, permission maybe, to not fall apart, or at least to fall apart with the knowledge that she'd been okay with leaving. I was with her. That's all I'll say about the actual moment. What I will say is that she had met with her attorney 8 months before she died and updated her will. I didn't know the contents. She had never discussed them with me, and I had never asked, because it felt like the kind of question you don't ask someone you love without it meaning something ugly. The will was read 2 weeks after the funeral. Gran left a house, her savings, and her investment accounts to me. The total value was approximately $1.4 million. She left my uncle a specific item, the photograph from the mantel. The one of him at 12, gap-toothed, squinting into the sun. He didn't say anything to me that day. He walked out of the attorney's office and I watched him go and I thought maybe that was how it would end. It wasn't. 6 weeks later, I was served. My uncle had retained an attorney and filed a claim contesting the will on the grounds that Gran had been experiencing cognitive decline at the time of signing and had been unduly influenced by me, her caregiver. He also claimed that as her biological child, he had a legal and moral entitlement to her estate. His attorney cited his years of emotional support, those Sunday phone calls, documented, consistent, and argued that my presence in the house during her final years had given me disproportionate and coercive influence over her decisions. He was suing for the full value of the estate. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my apartment for a long time after the process server left. I didn't cry. I wasn't even angry yet. I was something quieter than angry. I was looking at the word coercive in the document and thinking about Gran in her house slippers at the door the night I showed up with a backpack and no explanation. Then I got out of my car and I went inside and I opened my laptop. I couldn't afford an estate attorney. Gran's assets were frozen pending the litigation, which is apparently standard, which meant the money I needed to hire someone to protect the money was the money I didn't have access to. I talked to 3 attorneys who all told me my case had merit and that their retainers started at $15,000. I had $7,000 in my personal savings. I filed a response to the complaint myself. I found the forms on the state court website, and I read the instructions 3 times and I filled them out, and I drove to the courthouse and I filed them. The clerk didn't look up from her computer when she stamped them. I stood at that counter for a second after she handed back my copies, and I thought, okay. I spent the next 4 months inside the case law. I want to be honest about what that looked like. It wasn't a movie montage. It was me at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with a legal dictionary and 17 browser tabs open and a yellow highlighter running out of ink. It was me calling the law library helpline and asking the same question 3 different ways until I understood the answer. It was me printing documents and putting them in folders with handwritten tabs and then reorganizing the folders and starting over. I found 2 things that mattered. The first was the medical record. Gran's neurologist had documented her cognitive status at every appointment for the final 2 years of her life, and at the appointment closest to the date she signed the updated will, the doctor had specifically noted that she was alert, oriented, and demonstrated clear decision-making capacity. That note was dated 6 days before she signed. The second was something my uncle's attorney had included in their own filings, apparently without fully reading it, a family court record from 1987. When my uncle was 19, he had been granted a small monthly stipend from my grandparents' joint account to support himself while he was in college. The agreement, which my grandmother had signed, explicitly stated that in exchange for this support, he acknowledged he had no future claim to the estate beyond what was explicitly named in any will. He had received that stipend for 3 years. He had signed that document. His own attorney had submitted it. The morning of the hearing I wore the blazer Gran had bought me when I graduated from community college. It was navy blue and slightly too formal for most occasions, but she had insisted. "You never know when you'll need to look serious," she'd said. I had not expected to need it for this. I got to the courthouse 40 minutes early. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with my manila folder, and I went over my notes. People walked past me in suits, carrying briefcases, talking into phones, and I was just a person sitting on a bench with a highlighter behind her ear, and I thought about Gran in the gallery of that family courtroom 20 years ago in her church clothes, not letting me see her nervous. I decided not to let anyone see mine. My uncle's attorney went first. He was good. He talked about the Sunday calls and the long-standing relationship and the family bond. He used the word devoted several times. He submitted a calendar printed and laminated showing every Sunday for the past 4 years. Proof of contact, he said, proof of involvement. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked at the calendar for a moment. Then she asked my uncle's attorney to explain the 1987 family court document. There was a pause. A notable pause. The attorney said something about historical context and the limitations of decades-old agreements. The judge looked at him over the top of her glasses with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. It was the expression of a person who has heard a lot of explanations and is not hearing a new one. Then it was my turn. I stood up. I explained in plain language that my grandmother had been assessed as cognitively capable within the week before signing her will. I submitted the neurologist's note. I explained that my role as caregiver had been undertaken at significant personal cost. I listed what I had given up, without drama, just the facts, and that care is not coercion. I explained that my uncle had, in 1987, signed a legal agreement acknowledging no future claim to the estate beyond what a will explicitly named him. Then I said, he was not named. I sat down. The judge asked my uncle's attorney if he wished to respond to the 1987 document. He said they would need to review the matter further. The judge said she had reviewed it sufficiently. She ruled that same day. The will stood. The estate was mine. The claim was dismissed with prejudice, which the court clerk explained to me afterward, means it can't be refiled. I stood outside on the courthouse steps in Gran's navy blazer and the sun was out, which felt like an unearned gift. And I didn't know what to do with my hands. My uncle came out behind me. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at me and I looked at him and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he said, "She always liked you better." I thought about all the ways I could answer that. I thought about the 12-year-old in the photograph on the mantel, gap-toothed, squinting into the sun, and the woman who had kept that photograph there for 40 years. I said, "She loved you. She just knew what you'd do with it." He didn't respond. He walked down the steps and got into his car and drove away. And that was the last time I saw him. The house still smells like her. Not perfume. Something simpler. The specific smell of a place that has been lived in by the same person for a long time. A combination of wood and lemon soap and something I can't name. I've been told it will fade. I've been told most things do. I still have the index cards with her recipes. I made her chicken and dumplings last month, and I got the texture right on the first try. And I stood in her kitchen, my kitchen, and cried in a way I hadn't yet let myself cry, because the grief had been waiting behind all the paperwork, patient, and when the paperwork was done, it came. I still talk to the tomato plants. Just updates. We've had some cold nights, but you're doing fine. Don't rush yourself. I think she would have found the whole courtroom situation deeply undignified, and also would have been quietly thrilled by it. I think she would have made me recount the moment the judge looked at my uncle's lawyer over the top of her glasses, and she would have listened with her hands folded on the table and a very small smile and said, In exactly the way she said things, when she'd seen them coming. She saw most things coming. She picked me up off her porch at 11 years old, and she never once made me feel like a burden. And she spent 40 years building something, and she decided clearly and carefully and with full documentation from her neurologist to leave it to the person who had stayed. I stayed. That's the whole story. I stayed, and she noticed, and that's the whole story. I keep thinking about that 1987 document, the one my uncle's own attorney filed, the one that ended the whole thing. He had signed it when he was 19 years old, and for 30+ years it had been sitting in a courthouse file somewhere, quiet, waiting. He had forgotten about it, or assumed no one would ever go looking. And why would they? He was counting on the fact that I was a grieving 29-year-old with no legal training and no money for a lawyer, and that grief and exhaustion would make me small. What he didn't account for was that Gran had spent 18 years teaching me not to be small. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to get through something like that. Not the legal mechanics, but the internal thing. The part that happens before you file any paperwork, when you're sitting in a parking lot looking at the word coercive and deciding what you're going to do next. I think there are 3 things, and none of them are dramatic. They're quiet. They look boring from the outside. The first is knowing right from wrong and being unwilling to let the distance between them go unaddressed. That's not bravery exactly. It's more like an intolerance. Gran showed me that. She saw a kid on her porch with a backpack and no explanation, and she didn't calculate the inconvenience or wonder if it was really her problem. She just stepped aside and held the door. She had a clear sense of what a person owed another person, and she acted on it without ceremony, and I watched her do that for 18 years, until it became the only way I knew how to be. The second is the willingness to sit with something hard and learn it, even when you're not qualified and no one is helping you and it's 11 o'clock at night and your highlighter is running out. That's not intelligence in the way people usually mean it. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about refusing to let not knowing be a permanent condition. Every time I hit a wall with the case law, I found another door. I kept going back to the law library helpline. I reorganized the folders. I started over. You can go a very long way on just that, on the willingness to keep trying to understand. The third is endurance, not the cinematic kind, not pushing through one dramatic moment. The daily, undramatic, unglamorous kind. 4 months of kitchen table nights, driving to the courthouse on my lunch break. Showing up to a hearing in a blazer that was slightly too formal and sitting down alone at a respondent's table with a manila folder. Endurance is just showing up to the next thing, and then the next thing, until there isn't a next thing anymore. My uncle had a lawyer and a laminated calendar and 30 years of Sunday phone calls. What he didn't have was Gran's voice in his head every time he thought about quitting. I did. The outcome followed from that, I think. Not magically. Nothing about those 4 months was magic, but there's a real relationship between what a person puts in and what eventually holds. Gran put 18 years of dinners and school events and tomato plants and index cards into me, and when it mattered, I had something solid to stand on. That's the part I want to remember. Not winning, the standing.